Hi guys, in this video I want to talk about chipping fluid. That's because I've got a series of tutorials coming up where I'm painting some Zone Mortalis, sort of 40k Necromunda scenery. And chipping fluid is can be a useful tool to use for this. I've used chipping fluid now for years and years and years, and more recently I've shied away from it and I prefer painting the chips on, and particularly on sort of infantry and even most vehicles now. But I think when it comes to terrain, chipping fluid definitely still has a place, but I'll talk a little bit more about that on the actual terrain videos. This video is much more about what is it, what does it do, and what are the things we can do that affect how it works. Now, as you'll see in the video, and as I'm sure some of you may have experienced already, not all chipping fluid is created equal. So let's make sure that when we start the project, we at least understand what it is we're working with and how we can react and solve any problems we come up against. To begin with, we're going to put a layer of paint on our model. It's most likely going to be acrylic paint, and we'll talk about what colours we're going to choose for this when we come to paint the thing. But it's going to be a few layers of acrylic paint. And it's important that we make sure that this dries. Over this base layer, this in-world primer, if you will, we're going to put a layer of chipping fluid. Hairspray, heavy chipping, whatever, we'll talk about in a minute. And we make sure again that this is dry before we carry on. And then over this layer of chipping fluid, we're going to paint on whatever we want. So that might be one colour, or we might choose to do a pre-shade and another colour, or we might choose to use different colours over the top of it. Doesn't really matter. We're painting on more acrylic paint. And again, we make sure that we let this dry. Provided that acrylic paint is dry, water is not going to have any effect on it. It's not going to reactivate it. So next up, we grab our water. Now when we put the water on the surface, it's going to permeate through the acrylic paint and it's going to find the layer of chipping fluid. Now chipping fluid is reactivated by water, unlike the paint. So once it's reactivated, we're going to be able to manipulate it. And as long as our bottom layer of paint is dry, that's completely safe too. So the water's come through the top layer of paint, it's into the chipping fluid. And now we can take an object, it could be a toothbrush, toothpick, knife, whatever you want, and we can start to scratch away at the surface. And what this is going to do is lift away any of the chipping fluid that's underneath that object. It's also going to lift away anything that's on top of that bit of chipping fluid. So the paint, so this is chips of paint that are coming off. But again, the bottom layer is completely safe because it's dry. It's important that we understand this function and how the chipping fluid works, because what we can do is manipulate all the different stages of this process to get different results. So we can change the chipping fluid, we can change the paint we put over the top of it, we can change the layers of paint we put over the top of it, we can change what we do with the water, we can change the object that we use to scrape away. We've got control over all of those things and they'll all give us different results. Here's some common products that we use for chipping. Let's take a look at the first one, this little bottle of Vallejo water-based chipping medium. A lot of people will purchase this and bring it on classes where we ask them to bring chipping fluid. Then we've got this one by Scale 75, slightly different, very, very similar to things like AK and MIG's chipping fluid as well. It's a different base to it. And then we've got the original, Hairspray. And you want normal strength, or we certainly have found normal strength gives us the results that we like. For this demo, I'm just going to use a small piece of scenery from the Zone Mortalis kit to demonstrate on. I'm just giving it a base coat of brown paint here. It was a nice little hit of nostalgia or whatever when I was doing this. I haven't used this paint in absolutely ages. It's just in my bucket of like scenery paints. But I think it was one of the first ones I ever bought, and the smell of it's got a very strong smell. It's just a Vallejo model air paint, but it's the paint I used on the first big model I completed when I got back into the hobby, which was a Chaos Warhound Titan. Completely forgot about that model. Sold it years ago, so I might dig that out. But that's first model, big model I painted when I finished. So yeah, good fun. I'll see if I can find a few pictures of it. I did a very, very similar process to what I'll show in this video on it, actually. And it's something I've just adjusted over time. Now I'm just spraying on a slightly lighter brown. Again, this really isn't important. The recipes and stuff we're using in this video, I just want to demo stuff, but just paint it up like I would plan on painting it up. And last of all, I'll use a little bit of orange to create a bit more rust on the model. So as I say, in the series that I'm going to do on the Zone Mortalis, I'll talk through all different colours, why we use them, what we can use, and so on and so forth. But I figured for this tutorial, we may as well keep it as close to what we're actually going to do as we possibly can. But you can do, whatever you want at this stage. This doesn't have to be rusty metal that we're going to scrape through to. We could be painting a stripe over our normal armour colour. So I might have a yellow tank with a red stripe over it. So this is just me painting the normal yellows onto the model as if I was following my standard process for it. Next thing I want to talk about is varnish. Do we need to varnish if we're going to use chipping fluid? Let's go back to the exciting piece of paper. So we have our layer of paint here, acrylic paint. I can say acrylic paint because 99.9% of the time that's what we're going to be using. And again, providing it's dry, nothing's going to affect it. Okay, I say nothing's going to affect it. The water that we're using, the chipping fluid that we're using, etc., isn't going to affect it in any way. The two things that could affect the paint to remove it is alcohol, so isopropyl alcohol, and the key one here is abrasion. So if we are too rough when we're scraping things away, we will actually dig the paint and scrape it off the surface. Over the top of the paint, we put our layer of chipping fluid. Our water, whilst it does not affect our paint, it does affect the chipping fluid, remember. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I think it's important to really drill it in. So the water hits the chipping fluid, reactivates it, and it will lift away. But it has zero effect on the paint. So why on earth do we need to use varnish? Abrasion. If we're being really, really rough with the model, so like heavy toothbrush or things like that, or a knife, there's a chance that we could scrape away that paint. The gloss varnish will add a layer of protection to it. However, the gloss makes the surface much smoother. So as we chip away, you're going to get much, much larger chunks of paint coming off, and it'll also come off much, much easier, so with much less pressure. It may be something we want, it may not. It's definitely something we need to consider. So do we need to use varnish? Maybe. It depends on the situation. Probably not often. On one side of this cube, I will put on a few layers of gloss varnish so that we can see those things that I was talking about. Spraying it in my airbrush, I don't know, 25, 30 psi, something like that. I've thinned it 50-50. You can see how shiny it is already. First one we're going to take a look at is this Vallejo water-based chipping medium. It's probably the easiest to find in hobby shops. Most places stock Vallejo, and it's certainly one that people bring a lot of the time on classes. And I wanted to talk about it because it behaves completely differently to any of the other brands that I have tried. And for certain jobs, I don't think it's brilliant. And let's have a look at why. So I've popped it in my airbrush. This is the same PSI, so 25 PSI, not thinned. You can see just how patchy that's come out. So I'm going to turn the PSI on the airbrush up. So I'm going up to about 40 PSI now, almost double what I'd normally spray at. You can see it's improved it a little, but it's still not giving us a remotely smooth finish. And a smooth finish is going to give us a lot more control, because it means there's a uniform finish across it, so the paint will behave, or the chipping fluid will behave exactly the same wherever we scrape on the model. I'm going to thin it with some airbrush thinner. I don't think thinning it with water is a particularly good idea, because obviously the water activates it and all the rest of it. So I'm just going to use some Vallejo airbrush thinner, see if that improves it, staying at 40 psi. I've just dried it off with a hairdryer, and let's have a go now with this one. So we're just looking for that smooth finish. So it's a little better. It's still not brilliant, if what we're wanting is a smooth finish. But we'll give it a chance. So I'll dry it off with a hairdryer. Okay, so one more layer, and I'll try and give all the sides the same amount of layers. We'll just try and make this test, or this comparison, as fair as possible. Hairdryer again. Honestly, one of the most valuable hobby tools you can get, so grab one. That's it dried off. Now you can see it gives the surface a very gloss finish. It's a little bit patchy as well, you can see the light on it. Let's move on to the next one. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Scale 75 heavy chipping. You can see in the pot here, this is completely different to the Vallejo one really. This is much, much thinner. So I'm just going to tip it into the airbrush. I've left it at 40 psi because that's what we were using with the Vallejo. It's completely unthinned, just tipped it straight in. And you can see it sprays completely differently. This is a amazingly smooth coat we've got on here. The other brand that you're going to hear a lot about is the AK chipping fluid. As a brand, they produce a lot of that scale model type stuff. So do MIG, Ammo by MIG. I prefer their products if I'm honest, but they're very, very similar, if not the same. And I think maybe I prefer them just because of the range and the different sort of colours and whatnot they have. I would say the chipping fluid by those guys sits somewhere in between this Scale 75 one and the Vallejo one. So it's a little bit thicker. Sometimes I do add a drop of thinner, but I can achieve a nice smooth coat with it. The last product we're going to take a look at is hairspray. Now if it's a big model, you can just spray the hairspray out the can straight all over the model if you want. But if you want a bit more control, we can just decant it. So I often will just spray this straight into the cup of my airbrush, but you can spray it into another cup like I've done here, then just pour it in. And you can see that that's a tiny bit thicker than that Scale 75 one. This is really similar in consistency to the AK and Ammo by MIG. And if I'm honest, I'm pretty sure this is exactly what Worn Effects or whatever is by AK. I'm almost certain it's exactly the same thing. They just put it in a little bottle. Because this was what the scale modelers used in the first place. So again, I'm going to give it no thinning, try and give it the same amount of coats as the other ones. It does mean that your hobby room smells a bit like an older lady's hair salon though. Now we let the chipping fluid dry on all the sides, so let's lay down some paint over the top of it. I'm going to keep this really simple. I've just grabbed a green paint off the shelf, and I'm going to give all the sides the same amount of layers. I didn't even thin this one, just chucked it straight in the airbrush. So one of the first things that we can consider manipulating is how thick the layers of paint are that we put over the top of our chipping fluid. So the more paint that we apply, the longer it's going to take for the water to go through it and go into the chipping fluid. And the harder we're going to have to work to scratch through that to get to the chipping fluid. This is particularly important if we're going to apply paint through our airbrush. If we apply very, very thin layers, then it's going to take a couple of seconds for the water to go through and activate the chipping fluid, and you're going to need a very, very light touch when it comes to scraping the paint away. So what I've tried to do on these sides is put a little more paint at the bottom of each side than at the top. We have all the sides looking more or less identical. I've wiped up a little bit of paint as I've been handling the miniature, but it's not really an issue for this. So we have the gloss varnish side, which has the scale 75 over it. Then we've got the Vallejo side, which you can see, just see a little bit of that texture still showing through where we had the rough application of the Vallejo. Be interesting to see the results we get from that. Certainly not as smooth as the other sides. Like this scale 75 side looks very smooth. I'm wondering if there's not enough on there possibly. And then we have the hairspray side, so the classic, and the one that behaves an awful lot like the AK and MIG chipping as well. So I'm going to get a large flat brush, just some tap water, and let's see if we can activate the chipping fluids and see what they do. I'll just do it on the one side for now, and then we'll work on the larger areas in a bit. How unprofessional. Look at that phone noise. I want to make sure I treat all the sides as equally as possible so that we can compare them. It normally takes a good 20-30 seconds for the water to work through before you're going to see anything happening at all. I'd left this chipping fluid to dry for about 2 hours before I put the paint over the top of it, and that will affect it. I'll show you a demo a little bit later on about what happens if we leave it for much less time than that, 30 seconds a minute if that. The longest I've ever left it for is overnight, and it was still okay to work with. I just had to use a bit more water and wait a little bit longer. Now, toothbrush is a common tool people use to chip away. So let's see what happens here. I'm touching very gently on the model, you can see. Not a lot going on. Let's add a little bit more water. Just want to make sure we treat these sides exactly the same. Now, interestingly, just with that little extra water and the brush, we're starting to get a little bit of movement on the Vallejo side. So just the soft brush is beginning to move the chipping fluid away and the paint off the top. I'm really only noticing that particularly on the sort of very edges where they're most exposed. But you can see I've just ever so slightly rub that with the toothbrush and we've got these big chunks come away. I thought interestingly though, the tops come away easily, but the bottom we haven't really got anything yet. That's where that paint was a bit thicker. So try the same on the scale 75, same pressure, same movement. Absolutely nothing. And let's have a go on the hairspray side. Nothing just yet. And on the gloss varnish side, ooh. So we can see this is what happens with the gloss varnish. So we've got that really shiny surface that the gloss varnish gives, so it means that when the chipping fluid does come away, it's coming away in a really big chunk. So I think we'll leave the varnish side now. We don't need to demonstrate any more with that. Let's do a little bit more work on that Vallejo side, I think, in a second. Getting absolutely nothing on the scale 75. I'm wondering here whether we needed to apply a few more layers of the chipping fluid. Remember early on in the video I talked about we could manipulate each stage to get different effects. Now on the hairspray side, we're starting to get a little bit of movement. I'll persevere with this scale 75, but I do not have high hopes. So here I'm just using a fairly soft brush. Again, you're going to get different effects if you use a harder object or a softer object to chip the paint away with. And what I'll do now is fully soak the surfaces. And let's have a proper go at them, as if we were doing the model. One of the reasons I really like the hairspray as a material for this is the way it comes off the model feels very in scale with what we're working on. So we can get these super fine, see here, these super fine scratches and marks on the model. Whereas sometimes the heavy chipping style stuff can look a little bit over the top or not in keeping. So I think certainly if I'm working on a vehicle, or if I was working on a competition piece or something like that, I think I'd definitely be using the hairspray because of that control I have over it. If I want it to come off in bigger chunks, then I'll just spray more on. But what you want is something you know you can work with. The Vallejo, although it's given us this peculiar, this extreme effect, could actually be really useful for our scenery. If we want to create that super rusty, run-down underhive type look. So I think I will probably look at using a combination of the two. And I don't mean that on the same panel necessarily. We can also use something like a knife blade to do some fine scratches. Now this is something I would do on a model, definitely. You can get really cool looking scratches. And some people struggle to paint those fine scratches, whereas it's quite easy to do it with a knife blade. And when we come to do the actual scenery, I'll discuss the amounts that I'm going to use of each thing. So the base layer of paint, whether I use a varnish or not. I'm not going to use a varnish. And then how many layers of the chipping fluid that I apply. And it's really important that you do a little test piece like this so you know what you're going to do, so you'll get consistency across a project. You can see here I'm just ever so lightly scraping that knife blade across the Vallejo side, and the paint's just coming away really easily. And it does give us this textured finish, sort of like how paint will bubble up underneath when there's corrosion occurring. And again, on a model, I'm not so sure that would look so great, but I actually think for scenery it's really cool. It's almost like we've done the salt chipping effect, which I might talk about when we do the scenery, which is where essentially you do your main primer, then you sprinkle some salt or some water, and you sprinkle some salt on it, and then you let that dry, and then you put your chipping fluid over it, and then you carry on as normal. And what it means is when you chip it off, you get these little chunks like you have on the Vallejo. The Vallejo's effectively created those little chunks itself by the way it adheres, by the way it's been sprayed on, because it was so because it spit so much when it came out of the brush. We got those blobs. I'm just going to keep working away at the sides here. Dry it off, and we'll see what we're left with at the end. Again, I just want to reiterate, we're using this piece of scenery to demo the principles of the chipping fluid on. We're not looking at how we will chip. I'll cover that much more when we paint the actual scenery. So the techniques, why I choose to focus on certain areas, how much I'll use, and so on and so forth. This is literally just to demonstrate that theory we spoke about at the start of the video. I've had the hairdryer on it, and we can have a look now at what the sides look like. So this is the scale 75 side, and basically nothing has happened. I'm going to put this down to the scale 75 needing many more layers of chipping fluid before we actually get something occurring. But you can see how robust acrylic paint is. Nothing's really happened to it. The Vallejo side, well, that's pretty obvious. I think it looks awesome. Definitely going to use it. And then this last one is the hairspray side. I still love the effect that we get from hairspray. As I said, I think it looks a lot more controlled. I think it looks a lot more in scale with what we're painting. See if we can zoom in and have a slightly better look. So this is going to be much more obvious when we do the actual scenery, but you can see on the above the door there, I think that's a really nice effect we've got going on. Something we can play with. Now, one thing I did want to talk about was the drying time of the hairspray. So I mentioned the piece we used before. I left for a couple of hours, did it in the morning when I've had lunch and whatnot, and came back. And now we're going to look at what happens when we leave it for basically until it looks dry, and that's it. So I've sprayed on, I don't know, roughly the same amount. You can see how it's pooled a little strangely. So again, this is a way we could manipulate it if we wanted to. Now this is hairspray that I've used. You can see by heavily saturating the area, we're going to get build-ups. So we might get an effect not dissimilar to we had with our Vallejo. Again, this is a layer that we can manipulate and we can do some things with. And get the hairdryer on that for a matter of seconds. And here it is mostly dried off. It's barely even touch dry, if I'm honest, but it looks more or less dry. So this is, I suppose, an extreme example. Now, let's get some paint over the top of it. Use our same green. And all I want to do here is just sort of demonstrate the complete opposite end of the scale. Let's sort this focusing out, sorry. Now, following exact same process, got my large flat brush and apply some water over it. You see already there's a few little flecks starting to chip up and come off it. So I'll go to my little brush, pushing a little bit harder here. You can see on the hard edges it's breaking up, it's coming off. You can see that top left there where there was obviously a bigger chunk of it, it's coming off in bigger pieces. So again, this whole video we're just looking at how it's not a consistent product. It matters at each stage what we do. And it's important that we understand what we're doing at each stage so that we can manipulate it to get the result we want, but also to ensure that wherever possible, it does what we're expecting it to do. So we don't go and ruin a model and waste our time. So it's exactly the same as we've used on that side there. Much, much finer chipping, you can see. Much more subtle. But when we don't wait for that chipping fluid to dry for as long, we start to get a completely different effect. But I'm definitely going to use that Vallejo. I think it looks really cool. Which is nice, because generally I've never been happy with it when people have brought it on classes, when we've used it for things like damaging stripes and templates on models. Never looks quite right, because it's too rough, looks all corroded, and all we actually want it to look like is a bit of damage. If I zoom in here, you can see the other thing that occurs. If you don't let the chipping fluid dry fully, you'll start to get this strange bubbling, sort of almost like a crackle glaze effect, which you can see occurring just on here. And again, this isn't a problem if we know why it's occurred, and we can actually utilize it to get a different form of corrosion. So if I sprayed on the chipping fluid, didn't even let it go not touch dry, but didn't even look quite dry. If we spray our paint over the top of that, as it dries, we'll get this cool crackle effect. Yeah, it's something we can utilise in what we're doing. So I hope this video was useful for you guys. As I said, I wanted to do it as a standalone one because it's quite a lot of information. It's quite important information, and I didn't want it to just be a part of the scenery painting videos that I'm going to be doing. I feel like you need to understand this before we go on and do those. It also means that on those videos I can take a lot more time to talk about and focus in on why I'm choosing to do certain things, and I can just say use your chipping fluid here rather than having to go on and explain it loads. Alright, so let me know if you've got any questions about the products. Let me know if you've had any good or bad results with different products. As I say, my go-to is still hairspray, and in particular that Elnet hairspray, that normal strength hold, because I like the way it acts. It's not to say you shouldn't go out and try some different ones out, but that's the one I like using. As I say, I normally decant it just straight into my airbrush when I use it. But if I was doing tons of scenery, as I have done in the past when I've done some Zone Mortalis boards for people, I have just literally sprayed it out the can straight onto the model, because that works absolutely fine as well. And I will be using the Vallejo water-based chipping fluid as well in that little bottle for this, because it gives us that cool effect. I'm not going to be using that scale 75 one. I will have a go with it off camera and just see how many layers I actually needed to apply to get any sort of real chipping effect going on it, and I'll report that back to you guys during one of the future videos I do on the scenery kits. So let's recap over the key things that are going to affect how the chipping works. Do we apply gloss varnish? If we do, the chips are going to come off really, really easily. How many layers of chipping fluid we apply? If we apply one thin layer, it's not going to chip very easily at all. If we apply lots of layers of it, it's going to chip much easier. Then the paint we put over the top. If we apply a very thin layer of paint over the top, it will chip away very quickly. If we apply multiple layers, multiple different colours, it's going to be harder to chip as well. The water that we add, if we flood the surface and leave it to soak for ages, it will come away quicker. If we don't leave it for as long, we won't be able to remove it. And then the object that we use to chip away at the paint with. If this is a hard, sharp object, it's going to go right through and chip much easier than if we were to use a soft brush. So all of those things are going to affect the results that we get from it, and we need to bear them in mind. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, stick them in the comments, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into this Zone Mortalis board. Me and Andy and Rich are looking to play quite a lot of 40k next year. I'm working on some 30k projects at the moment as well, all Zone Mortalis based, so I'm really keen to have a board that I can play that on, and also, if I'm honest, a board that I can take some fun pictures on with the finished painted models. So I hope you're all well, and I'll talk to you next time.